Montana Territory, 1878. The rain slashed through the darkening sky, cutting visibility to little more than a few yards ahead. Kenton Hayes hunched lower in his saddle, water streaming from the brim of his hat as he squinted against the deluge. At 25, he had already seen enough of the world to know that a man relied on himself or he died, especially in these untamed lands where law was scarce and mercy scarcer still. His chestnut gelding plodded forward, head low against the driving rain. The horse was exhausted, and Kenton knew he wasn't faring much better. 3 days riding hard from Billings, with barely enough sleep to keep his eyes open. The cattle drive had gone south when rustlers hit them north of the Yellowstone, 3 good men dead, including his friend Thomas. Another lesson that companions were liabilities out here. Getting close to people only meant more pain when you lost them. Kenton flexed his fingers, stiff with cold inside his soaked leather gloves. The mountains loomed ahead, dark shadows against a darker sky. Somewhere out there waited empty plains, new herds, and the promise of solitude. That was all a man needed: open sky, good grazing, and no attachments to weigh him down or get him killed. Love was a luxury that frontier men couldn't afford, and one he'd sworn off years ago. Through sheets of rain, Kenton spotted a faint yellow glow ahead, a light in a window. His instincts told him to avoid it. Strangers meant danger. Yet his horse stumbled, reminding him they'd both likely die if they didn't find shelter soon. "Easy, Thunder," he murmured, patting the gelding's neck. "Let's see if they've got room for us." As he drew closer, the outline of a modest homestead materialized through the downpour. A sturdy cabin with smoke curling from the stone chimney, a small barn, and what appeared to be a corral. Nothing fancy but solid-looking. Someone had worked hard to carve this place from the wilderness. He was 10 yards from the porch when the cabin door swung open, spilling golden lamplight onto the rain-slicked ground. The silhouette of a rifle appeared first, followed by a woman's voice, clear and steady despite the howling wind. "That's far enough, stranger. State your business." Kenton reined Thunder to a halt, raising one hand slowly to show he meant no harm. "Name's Kenton Hayes, just looking for shelter from the storm. My horse is about done in, and I'm not much better." The rifle barrel didn't waver. "There's a town 15 miles south." "Not in this weather there isn't," Kenton replied, too tired to keep the edge from his voice. "I've got money if that helps, just need a place for the night." A long pause followed, filled only with the drumming of rain on his slicker. Finally, the rifle lowered slightly. "The barn's open, you can put your horse there," the voice said. "Come to the house after, but leave your guns outside." Kenton nodded and guided Thunder toward the barn. Only when he dismounted did he realize how bone-weary he truly was. His legs nearly buckled beneath him, and the simple task of unsaddling Thunder took 3 times as long as it should have. After seeing to his horse, Kenton approached the cabin, his gun belt in hand. He placed it on the covered porch as instructed, then knocked on the door. It opened to reveal a young woman, perhaps 22, with honey-blonde hair falling in loose waves past her shoulders. Her blue calico dress was simple but well kept, and her delicate features were set in a wary expression that couldn't quite hide her natural beauty. The rifle was still in her hands but pointed at the floor now. "You can come in," she said, stepping back, "but I'll have you know I'm quick with this and I don't miss." Kenton stepped inside, removing his hat. "Much obliged, miss. I promise I'll be gone at first light." The cabin's interior was modest but homey, polished wooden floors partially covered by hand-woven rugs, sturdy furniture that showed signs of craftsmanship, and shelves lined with books. A fire crackled in the stone hearth, and the smell of something cooking made Kenton's stomach rumble embarrassingly loud. The woman's expression softened slightly at the sound. "When's the last time you ate, mister?" "Hayes. Yesterday noon, miss." "Buckley, Katherine Buckley, most call me Kate." She set the rifle in a rack by the door but kept herself at a careful distance. "There's stew. You can have some, but then you'll sleep in the barn with your horse." "That's more than fair," Kenton said, working to keep his tone respectful. Something about her demeanor, the way she carried herself, alone in this wilderness, earned his instant respect. Katherine motioned toward a wash basin in the corner. "Clean up first, I won't have mud at my table." While Kenton washed the trail grime from his face and hands, he noted details about the cabin. A single plate on the table. One rocking chair by the fire, no men's boots or coats. She was alone out here, which seemed both brave and foolish. "You live here by yourself, Miss Buckley?" he asked, drying his hands on the offered towel. "That's not your concern," she replied, ladling stew into a bowl. "But yes, my father passed last winter. This is my claim now." Kenton took the seat she indicated and waited for her to sit before picking up his spoon. Dangerous country for a woman alone. Something flashed in her eyes, pride perhaps or defiance. No more dangerous than for a man, I expect, less maybe. I'm not fool enough to pick fights in saloons or chase outlaws. The stew was rich and flavorful, venison, potatoes, and vegetables from what must be her garden. Kenton ate slowly, savoring the first home-cooked meal he'd had in months. This is fine cooking, Miss Buckley. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Thank you. It's my mother's recipe. She studied him openly now. Where are you headed, Mr. Hayes? North, looking for ranch work, maybe, or I might try my hand at a claim of my own. Running from something, she asked bluntly. Kenton paused mid-bite, surprised by her directness. Not the law, if that's your worry, just moving on. Katherine nodded, accepting his answer without pressing further. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley and the rain intensified, hammering against the roof and windows. They ate in silence for a time, the crackling fire and drumming rain the only sounds. Looks like that storm's setting in for the night, she said eventually. You're lucky you found shelter when you did. Lightning flashed, illuminating the cabin in harsh white light, followed immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. The cabin seemed to shudder with the force of it. Katherine stood quickly. I need to check the barn. The horses spook easily in storms like this. I'll go, Kenton offered, rising. It's the least I can do for the meal. We'll both go, she countered, already reaching for a lantern and slicker. I don't know you well enough to trust my animals to your care. Outside, the rain fell in blinding sheets. They dashed to the barn, where Thunder and Katherine's bay mare were indeed agitated, whinnying and shifting nervously in their stalls. As Katherine spoke soothingly to her horse, Kenton noticed the barn roof leaking in several places. Your roof needs patching, he said, grabbing a bucket to catch the worst of the drips. I know that, she replied, a hint of irritation in her voice. It's on my list, right after fixing the corral, clearing another acre for planting, and a dozen other things. Another lightning strike, closer this time. The horses reared and neighed in fright. Thunder broke loose from his tether and crashed into a support beam, causing a section of the hayloft to crack ominously. Without thinking, Kenton lunged forward, tackling Katherine out of the way as a portion of the loft collapsed, sending hay and heavy timber crashing down where she had been standing moments before. They landed hard, Kenton's body shielding hers from the falling debris. For a brief moment they lay there, his arms around her, their faces inches apart. Her eyes were wide with shock, her breath coming in quick gasps that matched his own. Are you hurt? He asked, suddenly aware of their position. No, she whispered, then seemed to collect herself. Please get off me, Mr. Hayes. Kenton quickly rolled away and helped her to her feet, both of them brushing hay and dust from their clothes. The horses were still agitated but unharmed, and the damaged section of the loft seemed stable for now. Thank you, Katherine said stiffly. You have quick reflexes. Comes with the territory, he replied. This is dangerous. We should head back to the house until the storm passes. She nodded but first checked both horses thoroughly, then helped Kenton secure the animals away from the damaged section. By the time they returned to the cabin, they were both soaked through despite their slickers. Katherine disappeared behind a screen to change into dry clothes, while Kenton awkwardly stood dripping on the threshold. She emerged in a fresh dress and handed him a bundle of fabric. These were my father's. They'll be large on you, but they're dry. The offered clothes, a flannel shirt and woolen trousers, were indeed several sizes too big, but Kenton was grateful to change behind the same screen. When he emerged, Katherine had set 2 mugs of coffee on the table and was poking at the fire. I think we can agree that the barn isn't safe tonight, she said without looking at him. You can sleep here. On the floor. Kenton wanted to refuse, to insist on the barn despite the danger. Staying in the house meant crossing a line, one that would complicate the clean, attachment-free life he'd built for himself. And yet, the woman had nearly died moments ago. He couldn't leave her alone with a partially collapsed barn during the worst storm he'd seen in years. I appreciate that, Miss Buckley. She glanced at him then, her expression unreadable. I still don't trust you, Mr. Hayes. I'll be keeping my father's revolver close. I wouldn't expect anything less, he said, accepting the coffee she offered. The storm continued to rage outside, keeping them confined to the small cabin. To pass the time, Katherine brought out a deck of cards. They played several hands of poker, betting with matchsticks instead of money. Where did a proper young lady learn to play poker like this? Kenton asked after she won her third consecutive hand. A smile touched her lips. My father believed women should know how to do everything men can do. He taught me to shoot, hunt, play cards, and run this homestead. He sounds like a wise man. He was, she said softly, shuffling the cards with practiced ease. What about you, Mr. Hayes? You're young to be wandering alone. Kenton stared into his coffee. Left home at 16, worked cattle drives, did some scouting for the army, nothing worth telling. Everyone has a story worth telling, she countered. You just don't want to tell yours. Their eyes met across the table, and Kenton felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. This woman saw too much. My story's like many out here, he said eventually. Parents died of fever when I was 14. Older brother took a bullet in a saloon fight 2 years later. Found out the hard way that getting attached to people is a good way to get your heart torn out. She dealt another hand in silence, considering his words. That's a lonely way to live. It's a safe way to live, he corrected. Is it? She arranged her cards thoughtfully. Seems to me a man with no connections has no one to watch his back, no one to help when the hayloft comes crashing down. Kenton had no ready answer for that. They played in silence, the storm providing a constant backdrop of sound. Later, as Katherine prepared for bed, Kenton made a pallet of blankets near the fire. She disappeared into her bedroom but left the door cracked open, likely to keep an eye on him, he thought. Sleep didn't come easily. He lay awake, listening to the storm and thinking about Katherine Buckley. There was something compelling about her, not just her beauty, but her fierce independence and clear-eyed view of the world. She was surviving out here on her own terms, facing the same wilderness that had claimed so many. Dawn broke with tentative fingers of sunlight pushing through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a washed-clean world glistening with raindrops. Kenton rose early, folded his borrowed blankets, and stepped outside to check on the horses. The damage to the barn looked worse in daylight. A significant portion of the hayloft had collapsed, and rain had soaked through in several places. Repairing it would be a massive job for one person, especially a woman alone. When he returned to the cabin, Katherine was already up, her hair braided, cooking breakfast over the fire. Your barn needs significant work, he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot. That roof won't last another storm. She flipped a flapjack with practiced ease. I'm aware of that, Mr. Hayes. I could stay a few days, help you repair it. The offer surprised them both. Kenton hadn't planned to say it, and Katherine clearly hadn't expected it. She turned to look at him, spatula in hand. Why would you do that? He shrugged, uncomfortable under her scrutiny. You fed me, gave me shelter. Seems the decent thing to do. I don't need charity, she said, chin lifting. It's not charity, it's payment for services rendered, fair exchange. Katherine studied him for a long moment, then turned back to her cooking. 3 days, we fix the roof, shore up that support beam, and then you move on. I'll provide meals and a place to sleep in the repaired barn. Agreed, Kenton said, wondering why he felt relieved rather than trapped by this unexpected detour. They spent that first day salvaging what they could from the damaged barn. Katherine proved as capable as she'd claimed, working alongside Kenton without complaint despite the heavy labor. They cleared the fallen debris, sorted through the damaged lumber to see what could be reused, and assessed what new materials they would need. By midday, they had developed an easy working rhythm. Katherine was quick-witted and resourceful, finding solutions to problems before Kenton even finished explaining them. She knew her property intimately, where the best trees for lumber stood, which stream had the steadiest flow for their water needs, which fields drained best after heavy rain. How long have you been out here? He asked as they took a brief break for water. 4 years, she replied, wiping her brow with her sleeve. Father and I came from St. Louis after Mother died. He'd always dreamed of having his own land. And now it's your dream. She looked around at the modest homestead. It wasn't at first, but now, yes, this is my home. I've put too much of myself into this place to abandon it. That evening, after a simple but satisfying dinner, Katherine brought out a book. My father used to read aloud in the evenings, she explained, opening to a marked page. Helps pass the time. To Kenton's surprise, she began to read from a volume of Tennyson's poetry. Her voice was clear and expressive, bringing the words to life in a way that made him see beyond the rough cabin walls to visions of knights and ladies, honor and sacrifice. He found himself looking forward to the next evening's reading as much as he anticipated the satisfaction of honest work. On their second day of repairs, they rode to town for supplies. Silver Creek was little more than a wide spot in the trail, a general store, saloon, blacksmith, and a handful of other buildings clustered around a dusty main street. As they tied their horses outside the general store, Kenton noticed Katherine straighten her spine and lift her chin, as if preparing for battle. Inside, the storekeeper greeted them with barely concealed surprise. "Miss Buckley didn't expect to see you in town so soon after that storm," the balding man said, eyes darting curiously to Kenton. "Good morning, Mr. Phillips. We need supplies for barn repairs," she replied briskly, ignoring his obvious curiosity. While Katherine listed their needs, Kenton noticed other customers watching them and whispering. An older woman approached Katherine with a sympathetic smile. "Katherine, dear, so good to see you. We've been worried since your father's passing. Have you reconsidered Mr. Marsh's offer? He was just saying yesterday that his proposal still stands." Katherine's smile tightened. "Please tell Mr. Marsh that my answer remains the same. This is my land, not his." The woman clicked her tongue disapprovingly. "A young woman alone, it's not proper, and winter will be here before you know it." "I've survived worse," Katherine said firmly, ending the conversation by turning back to her supply list. As they loaded their purchases onto the wagon, Kenton caught sight of a tall, well-dressed man watching them from outside the bank. The man's expression was calculating as his gaze traveled between Katherine and Kenton. "Who's that?" Kenton asked quietly. Katherine glanced over and her jaw tightened. "Victor Marsh, owns the bank and half the businesses in town. He's been trying to buy my land since father died." "That the same Marsh the lady in the store mentioned?" "Yes," she said shortly. "He's proposed marriage twice. Claims he's concerned for my welfare, but all he wants is my water rights. There's gold in the hills above my property, and whoever controls that stream controls the mining operations." Kenton studied the man more carefully. "Seems like the persistent type." "He is," she agreed grimly, "but so am I." They drove past Marsh, who tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Miss Buckley," he called out, "fine day. I see you've hired help at last." Katherine nodded stiffly but didn't stop the wagon. As they left town, Kenton noticed her hands were white-knuckled on the reins. "Town doesn't seem very supportive of your independence," he observed. She sighed. "They mean well, most of them. They just can't imagine a woman choosing to live without a man's protection. And Marsh has been spreading rumors that I'm in financial trouble, hoping I'll get desperate enough to sell." "Are you? In trouble, I mean." Katherine shot him a warning glance. "I manage. The garden produces well, I sell preserves and eggs in town, and I've got some savings from father's army pension." Kenton nodded, respecting her pride. "Well, after we fix that barn, you'll be in better shape for winter." The next 2 days passed in a blur of hard work. They replaced rotted support beams, reinforced the structure, and patched the roof. Katherine worked tirelessly alongside him, her determination never flagging even when the tasks required significant strength. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation that grew increasingly comfortable. Kenton found himself watching her when she wasn't looking, the grace of her movements, the tiny smile that appeared when she was pleased with her work, the intelligence in her eyes when she solved a problem. She was unlike any woman he'd ever known, practical yet gentle, independent yet vulnerable in ways she tried hard to hide. On the evening of the third day, they stood back to admire their handiwork. The barn looked better than before the storm, stronger, more secure. "It'll stand up to anything now," Kenton said with satisfaction. Katherine nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and something else he couldn't quite read. "Thank you, Kenton, I couldn't have done this alone." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice created an unexpected warmth in his chest. "You'd have found a way," he replied. "You're resourceful." She smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her face and sent his heart racing. "Perhaps, but it would have taken all summer, and by then winter would be upon us." The word "us" hung in the air between them, though Kenton knew she hadn't meant it that way. Still, he found himself reluctant to mention his departure, scheduled for the following morning as they'd agreed. That night, Katherine's reading selection was different, a collection of frontier stories rather than poetry. As she read about pioneers and their struggles, Kenton watched the firelight play across her features. The thought of riding away in the morning left him with a hollow feeling he didn't want to examine too closely. "I should check the horses one last time," he said when she finished reading, needing some air to clear his head. In the barn, now solid and secure, thunder greeted him with a soft nicker. Kenton absently stroked the horse's neck, his mind elsewhere. "You're getting soft," he muttered to himself. "3 days with a pretty woman and you're forgetting everything you know about surviving out here." The sound of footsteps made him turn. Katherine stood in the doorway, a lantern in her hand. "I thought I should check on the mare," she said, though the horse was clearly settled for the night. She crossed to the stall, avoiding his eyes. "I'll be heading out at first light," Kenton said, the words tasting bitter somehow. Katherine nodded, still not looking at him. "Of course, as we agreed." An awkward silence fell between them, broken only by the horse's quiet breathing. "I made some extra provisions for your journey," she said finally, "just some biscuits and jerky." "Thank you, that's kind." Another silence. Katherine took a deep breath as if coming to a decision. "Mr. Hayes, Kenton, I could use some more help around here if you're not in a hurry to move on. Paid work, of course. There's the south field that needs clearing, and the roof on the cabin could use some attention too." The offer hung in the air between them. Kenton knew he should refuse. Staying meant complications, attachments, the very things he'd sworn to avoid. "And yet I could stay a week or so," he heard himself say, "get you squared away before winter." The smile that lit her face made his heart stumble. That would be very helpful. She extended her hand to shake on their new arrangement, but when his fingers closed around hers, neither seemed willing to let go. They stood like that, hands clasped, eyes locked, until a soft whicker from one of the horses broke the spell. Katherine withdrew her hand quickly, a blush rising to her cheeks. "Well, good night then," she said, turning toward the door. "Katherine," he called after her. She paused, looking back. "I'm glad your barn collapsed." She blinked, then laughed, a bright, genuine sound that seemed to fill the entire barn. "That's a terrible thing to say, Mr. Hayes." "But true," he replied with a grin. "Good night," she said again, but her smile remained as she disappeared into the darkness. 1 week stretched into 2, then a month. Summer deepened around the homestead as they fell into a comfortable routine. They repaired the cabin roof, cleared new ground for planting, and reinforced the root cellar for the coming winter. In the evenings, they shared meals and conversation, discovering a surprising alignment in their views on everything from politics to literature. Kenton learned that Katherine had been educated at a ladies' seminary in St. Louis before coming west with her father. She learned that beneath his gruff exterior, he had a quick mind and dry humor that matched her own. They argued good-naturedly about the best way to break horses, the fairness of territorial politics, and whether Shakespeare or Dickens was the superior writer. Through it all, Kenton felt the walls he'd built around himself slowly crumbling. Each morning he told himself he would leave soon, after this project was finished, after the harvest was in, after the first frost. But each day, the thought of leaving became more difficult to bear. One evening in late summer, they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold. Katherine was mending a shirt while Kenton whittled a new handle for her garden hoe. "Why did you really stay?" she asked suddenly, setting aside her sewing. Kenton's knife stilled. "You needed help." "There are plenty of homesteads that need help. You could have worked for wages anywhere." He stared out at the darkening landscape, trying to find words for something he barely understood himself. "I suppose I found something here worth staying for." Their eyes met, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken feelings. Katherine's cheeks flushed pink in the fading light. The moment was shattered by the sound of approaching horses. 3 riders appeared on the trail leading to the homestead, and Katherine stiffened beside him. "Marsh," she said quietly, standing up, "and his men." Kenton rose, positioning himself slightly in front of her as the riders approached. Victor Marsh was instantly recognizable, expensively dressed despite the frontier setting, with a silver watch chain gleaming across his vest. The 2 men flanking him had the hard eyes and watchful posture of hired guns. "Miss Buckley," Marsh called out, reining in his horse. "Beautiful evening." "Mr. Marsh," Katherine acknowledged coolly. "What brings you out this way?" Marsh's gaze flicked to Kenton, assessing. "I see your hired hand has become a permanent fixture. Interesting arrangement." "State your business, Marsh," Kenton said, disliking the implication in the man's tone. "My business is with Miss Buckley," Marsh replied smoothly. "But since you ask, I've come with news and an offer. The territorial court has approved my petition to redirect water for mining operations. Starting next month, the stream that feeds your property will be diverted to service the new stamp mill." Katherine went pale. "You can't do that. My water rights are legally filed." Indeed they are, Marsh agreed with false sympathy. For domestic and agricultural use, the court has determined that industrial development takes precedence, progress, you understand. Without that water this land is worthless, Katherine said, anger replacing shock in her voice. Not worthless, Marsh corrected, just significantly less valuable, which brings me to my offer. I'm still willing to purchase your property at a fair price considering the changed circumstances. Or, he added with a meaningful look, my marriage proposal remains open. As my wife you would want for nothing. Kenton's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Katherine's fingers wrapped around his wrist, stopping him. I'll need to see these court papers, she said, her voice steady despite her evident distress. Marsh reached into his coat and produced a folded document. By all means, review it with your friend. My offer stands for 1 week. After that, the water stops flowing, and so does the price I'm willing to pay. He tipped his hat, turned his horse, and rode away with his men following close behind. Katherine unfolded the papers with trembling hands. As she read, her expression grew increasingly grim. Is it legal? Kenton asked when she finally looked up. It appears to be, she said, voice hollow, signed by Judge Thornton in Helena. Marsh must have bribed him. Thornton owns shares in several mining operations. Katherine sank back onto the porch step, the paper crumpled in her fist. For the first time since he'd known her, she looked defeated. Without water, nothing will grow, the livestock can't survive, everything my father and I built, her voice broke. Kenton sat beside her, anger burning in his chest. There has to be a way to fight this. How? The nearest honest judge is in Bozeman, weeks away, and even if I could appeal, it would take money I don't have, she laughed bitterly. Marsh has been planning this all along. He knew exactly how to make my land worthless to anyone but him. Kenton took her hand, his mind racing. We'll figure something out, I promise you won't lose your home. She looked at him then, tears glistening in her eyes. We. There is no we, Kenton, you're a drifter who stayed a while, this isn't your fight. The words stung, but he recognized the fear behind them. Maybe I'm tired of drifting, maybe I've found someplace worth fighting for. Katherine's expression softened, but she pulled her hand away. I need to think alone. She rose and went into the cabin, leaving Kenton on the porch with a growing determination. He might not have much to offer, but he had experience with men like Marsh, powerful, corrupt men who took what they wanted because no one stood in their way. Well, this time someone would. The next morning, Katherine was quiet, her eyes shadowed from a sleepless night. She went about her chores mechanically, avoiding conversation beyond what was necessary. Kenton gave her space, using the time to think through options and formulate a plan. By midday, he had saddled Thunder and packed his saddlebags. When Katherine saw him preparing to leave, something flashed in her eyes, hurt perhaps, or resignation. So you're going after all, she said, arms crossed protectively over her chest. Not for good, he replied, checking his cinch. I'll be back in 3 days. There's someone in Silver Creek I need to see. She frowned. What are you planning, Kenton? Better you don't know yet, but I promise I'm not abandoning you. He hesitated, then stepped closer, taking her hands in his. Trust me, Katherine, please. She searched his face, then nodded slowly. 3 days, then I want the truth, whatever it is. You'll have it, he promised. The ride to Silver Creek took most of the afternoon. Rather than heading to the main street, Kenton circled around to the modest cabin behind the blacksmith shop, where he'd heard the town's part-time lawman stayed when in the area. Marshal Samuel Cooper was older than Kenton expected, perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair and the weathered face of a man who'd spent decades in the elements. He was cleaning a shotgun on his porch when Kenton rode up. Help you, son? Cooper asked, not pausing in his work. I hope so, Marshal. I'm here about Victor Marsh and some questionable water rights. Cooper's hands stilled. He studied Kenton with shrewd eyes. You'd be the young man staying out at the Buckley place. Kenton dismounted. Name's Kenton Hayes, and yes, I've been working for Miss Buckley. Sit down, Cooper said, gesturing to a second chair. Marsh is a subject I find increasingly interesting these days. For the next hour they talked. Kenton explained the situation with Katherine's water rights, while Cooper shared what he knew about Marsh's operations. The marshal had been building a case against Marsh for months, evidence of claim jumping, witness intimidation, and suspected bribery of officials. Problem is, Cooper said, refilling their coffee cups, Marsh is careful. Keeps his hands clean while his men do the dirty work, and he's got friends in territorial government who make my job difficult. But this water rights issue, surely that's something concrete. Cooper nodded thoughtfully. It could be. Especially if Judge Thornton was bribed to sign that order, but proving it would require evidence. What kind of evidence? Money trail correspondence, something tying Marsh directly to corrupt activities. The marshal leaned forward. Word is, Marsh keeps a safe in his office above the bank, supposedly contains documents he wouldn't want made public. Kenton considered this information, if someone could access that safe. That would be breaking and entering, Cooper warned, which I couldn't condone. However, he added with a meaningful look, I happen to be leaving for Helena tomorrow, won't be back for 4 days. Whatever happens while I'm gone would be outside my jurisdiction. Kenton smiled grimly. I understand completely, Marshal. Cooper handed him a folded paper. Here's a copy of a warrant I've been trying to get approved for Marsh's arrest. If evidence supporting these charges happen to appear on my desk when I return, it would be very helpful. That night, Kenton took a room above the Silver Creek Saloon and worked through the details of his plan. The bank building was 2 stories, with Marsh's private office on the upper floor. During the day, accessing it unnoticed would be impossible, but at night. The next evening, Kenton watched from the shadows as Marsh locked the bank and headed toward his large house at the edge of town. Once the street was quiet, he made his way to the rear of the building. The bank's back door was solid and well locked, but the second-floor window had a narrow ledge beneath it that could be reached from the adjacent building's roof. The climb was treacherous in the dark, but Kenton had spent years navigating difficult terrain. When he reached the window, he found it locked but poorly secured. A careful application of his knife popped the latch and he slipped inside. Marsh's office was opulent by frontier standards, a large oak desk, leather-bound books on shelves, and a Persian carpet covering most of the floor. Behind the desk hung a large painting of a mountain scene. Kenton moved it aside to reveal, as Cooper had suggested, a wall safe. Cracking it would be the challenge. Kenton pressed his ear to the metal door and slowly turned the dial, listening for the subtle clicks that might indicate the tumblers falling into place. It was a skill he'd learned from a safecracker he'd once shared a jail cell with, a misspent night in his youth that now proved unexpectedly useful. After nearly an hour of patient work, the safe swung open. Inside were stacks of cash, several leather-bound ledgers, and folders of documents. Kenton ignored the money and focused on the papers, skimming quickly by the light of a small candle. What he found exceeded his expectations. Not only were there letters proving Marsh had bribed Judge Thornton for the water rights ruling, but also documentation of claim jumping, threatened witnesses, and even 2 murders disguised as accidents. Marsh had kept meticulous records of his crimes, perhaps as insurance against his partners. Kenton selected the most damning documents, replaced everything else, and closed the safe. He was repositioning the painting when a floorboard creaked behind him. I'm impressed, Victor, Marsh said, the click of a pistol hammer accompanying his words. Few men would have the skill to open that safe. Or the stupidity to break into my office. Kenton turned slowly, the stolen documents hidden inside his shirt. Marsh stood in the doorway, revolver aimed steadily at Kenton's chest. Behind him loomed one of his hired men. Marsh, Kenton acknowledged, mind racing for a way out of this predicament. Hayes, isn't it, Miss Buckley's employee? Marsh's smile was cold. I suspected you might be trouble. What I didn't expect was that you'd be foolish enough to commit a hanging offense. The only one facing a noose will be you, once these documents reach the territorial marshal, Kenton replied. Marsh laughed. Documents that were stolen during a burglary. Even if they were admissible, which they're not, they'll never leave this room. He gestured with his gun. Williams, check what he took. The hired man stepped forward, reaching for Kenton's shirt. It was the opportunity Kenton had been waiting for. He drove his fist into Williams's throat, then used the man's body as a shield against Marsh's first shot. In the confusion, Kenton launched himself toward the window he'd entered through. Marsh fired again, the bullet splintering the window frame as Kenton dove through the opening. He hit the ledge hard, nearly losing his balance before scrambling onto the adjacent roof. Behind him, Marsh was shouting for his men. Kenton ran across the rooftop, leapt to a lower building, then dropped to the alley below. Pain shot through his left arm. Marsh's second bullet had grazed him, tearing his sleeve and leaving a bloody furrow along his bicep. Ignoring the wound, he sprinted toward the livery where he'd left Thunder. The gelding sensed his urgency and didn't resist being saddled and ridden hard out of town. Kenton took a roundabout path, using stream beds and rocky ground to hide his trail from any pursuers. Only when he was certain they weren't being followed did he slow to a pace Thunder could maintain for the journey back to Catherine's homestead. The sun was rising by the time he arrived, his arm throbbing and blood dried on his sleeve. Katherine ran from the house as he dismounted, her face pale with worry. "You're hurt," she said, reaching for him. "It's just a graze," he assured her, though he was lightheaded from blood loss and a night without sleep. "But we need to leave. Now, pack only what's essential." She stepped back. "Leave? What happened, Kenton?" "I found proof that Marsh bribed Judge Thornton and committed other crimes. But he caught me taking the documents. He'll be coming here next." Catherine's eyes widened. "You broke into his office." "It was the only way," Kenton said, swaying slightly on his feet. "The evidence is solid, but we need to get it to Marshal Cooper in Helena, and Marsh will try to stop us." Katherine steadied him, then made a quick decision. "Inside. Let me bandage that arm while I pack." Within the hour, they had loaded essential supplies onto Catherine's wagon. She had worked efficiently, showing no hesitation once she understood the gravity of their situation. Before they left, she took one last look at the homestead she had built with her father. "We'll get it back," Kenton promised, seeing the pain in her eyes. "Once Marsh is arrested, your water rights will be restored." She nodded, squaring her shoulders. "Let's go, then." They took the northern trail toward Helena, pushing as hard as they dared. Kenton rode Thunder alongside the wagon, scanning the terrain constantly for signs of pursuit. His arm ached beneath Catherine's careful bandaging, but the bleeding had stopped. By mid-afternoon, they had reached the foothills, where the trail narrowed between rocky outcroppings. It was the perfect place for an ambush, and Kenton's instincts screamed danger. "Hold up," he called to Katherine. "Something's not right." She reined in the wagon horses, her hand moving to the rifle beside her. "Marsh." Before Kenton could answer, gunfire erupted from the rocks above. A bullet splintered the wagon seat inches from Catherine's hand. Kenton spurred Thunder forward, returning fire with his revolver as Katherine grabbed her rifle. "Get down," he shouted, laying covering fire as she scrambled for shelter behind a boulder. From his vantage point, Kenton could make out 3 gunmen positioned among the rocks, Marsh and 2 hired guns. They had the high ground and better cover. A straight firefight would end badly. "We need to flank them," he called to Katherine, who was calmly loading her rifle. "Can you keep them occupied while I work around to the left?" She nodded, levering a round into the chamber. "Be careful." Kenton dismounted and moved into the brush, using the terrain for cover as he circled behind their attackers. Katherine fired periodically, forcing Marsh and his men to keep their heads down. The uphill climb was grueling, especially with his injured arm, but Kenton managed to position himself above and behind one of Marsh's gunmen. The man never heard him coming. Kenton brought the butt of his revolver down hard and the gunman crumpled without a sound. 1 down, 2 to go. Advancing carefully, Kenton spotted the second man, Williams, the hired gun from the office. He was focused on Catherine's position, unaware of the threat behind him. Kenton took careful aim and fired. Williams jerked, clutched his shoulder, and fell backward down the rocky slope. That left only Marsh. Kenton moved toward the banker's position, staying low, but Marsh was no longer firing at Katherine. He had disappeared from his perch. A chill ran down Kenton's spine. Where was Marsh? His answer came in the form of a rifle barrel pressed against his back. "Drop it, Hayes," Marsh ordered, "or I'll put a bullet through your spine." Kenton slowly lowered his gun. "It's over, Marsh. Williams is down and your other man is unconscious. Even if you kill me, those documents will reach the marshal." "Perhaps," Marsh acknowledged, his voice eerily calm, "but you'll be dead and Miss Buckley will be alone again, vulnerable. Maybe I'll marry her after all, once she's properly grateful for my protection." The threat to Katherine ignited something primal in Kenton's chest. In one fluid motion, he ducked and twisted, knocking the rifle barrel aside as it discharged. The shot went wide. Marsh stumbled back, trying to bring the rifle to bear again, but Kenton was already on him. They grappled at the edge of the outcropping, Marsh's surprising strength fueled by desperation. The banker landed a solid blow to Kenton's wounded arm, sending a white-hot flare of pain through him. But Kenton had survived years on the frontier by being tougher and more determined than his opponents. He drove his fist into Marsh's solar plexus, then followed with an uppercut that sent the man staggering backward. Marsh's foot slipped on loose rock. His arms windmilled as he fought for balance, then failed. With a cry of terror, he plummeted over the edge, hitting the slope below with a sickening thud. Kenton collapsed to his knees, breathing hard. The sound of running footsteps made him look up. Katherine was climbing toward him, rifle in hand, her face tight with concern. "Kenton," she called, "are you all right?" He nodded, unable to speak, as the adrenaline drained from his system. She reached his side and knelt beside him, her hands moving over him, checking for new injuries. "I'm okay," he managed finally. "Marsh is down, probably dead." Katherine glanced over the edge, then quickly looked away from whatever she saw. "The other two. One unconscious, one wounded, they won't be a problem." He struggled to his feet with her help. "We need to keep moving, Helena's still 2 days away." They collected the unconscious gunman's weapons, secured Williams with rope from the wagon, and left both men with water and basic supplies. Marsh's body lay broken at the bottom of the ravine, beyond help. As they continued their journey, Kenton felt a strange lightness despite his exhaustion and pain. For the first time in years, he had fought for something larger than his own survival, for justice, for a home for Katherine. That night they made camp in a sheltered grove beside a stream. Katherine rebandaged his arm, her touch gentle but her expression troubled. "You could have been killed," she said softly, securing the fresh bandage. "But I wasn't," he replied, catching her hand. "Katherine, I'd do it again for you." She met his gaze, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. Why risk everything for my land, my fight?" "Because somewhere along the way it became my fight too." He took a deep breath, finally admitting what he'd been trying to deny for weeks. "Because I love you." The words hung in the night air between them. Katherine's eyes widened, then softened with an emotion that made his heart race. "I told myself not to love you," she whispered, "that you would leave like everyone else. That caring for someone only leads to loss." "I thought the same," he admitted, "that attachments were dangerous, that the only safe path was to stay alone." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I was wrong." Katherine leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that started gently but quickly deepened with all the emotion they'd held back. When they finally parted, both were breathless. "I love you," she said simply, "and I'm terrified of what that means." "It means we face whatever comes next together," Kenton replied, drawing her close. "It means neither of us has to be alone anymore." They reached Helena 2 days later and delivered the evidence to Marshal Cooper, who had connections with honest judges untouched by Marsh's corruption. The legal proceedings moved swiftly after that. Judge Thornton was removed from the bench, the corrupt water rights decree was invalidated, and Katherine's rightful claim was restored. Williams faced trial for his crimes as Marsh's enforcer, providing testimony that implicated several other corrupt officials in exchange for leniency. The conspiracy that had threatened Katherine's homestead was dismantled piece by piece. A month later, they returned to the Buckley homestead. Fall was painting the mountains in golds and reds, and the first hint of winter hung in the crisp air. The cabin stood waiting just as they had left it. The stream flowed clear and strong through the property, their water rights now secure. As Katherine stepped down from the wagon, Kenton took her hand. "Home at last," he said. She turned to him with a smile that took his breath away. Almost. That evening, as sunset gilded the distant peaks, they sat on the porch steps, planning the improvements they would make before winter arrived. "We should expand the root cellar," Katherine was saying, "and maybe add another room to the cabin come spring." Kenton watched her animated face as she spoke, marveling at how his life had changed in the span of a season. From a drifter convinced that attachments meant vulnerability, he had found strength in loving someone worth fighting for. "Katherine," he said, interrupting her plans for spring planting, "marry me." She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes wide. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, taking her hands in his. "Not because you need protection or because of what people in town might say. Marry me because I love you and want to build this life with you, this home, this future. Because one night of shelter turned into a lifetime I never knew I wanted until I found you." Tears filled her eyes, but her smile was radiant. "Yes," she whispered, "yes, I'll marry you, Kenton Hayes." They were married 2 weeks later in Silver Creek's small church. The same townspeople who had once pitied Katherine for her stubborn independence now celebrated the union of two people whose courage had exposed corruption and brought justice to their community. The following spring, they expanded the cabin and added a nursery. By summer, Katherine's garden flourished and they had increased their cattle herd. When the first snows of winter blanketed the homestead, they welcomed their daughter into a home built on love rather than fear, connection rather than isolation. As Kenton held his infant daughter beside the fire, Katherine leaning against his shoulder, he marveled at the journey that had brought him here. He had ridden into a storm seeking shelter for one night and found a woman worth a lifetime, a woman who had shown him that true strength came not from standing alone, but from the courage to love despite the risks. Outside, snow fell gently on the homestead they had defended and built together. Inside, the warmth of family and future filled every corner of their home. The drifter had found his anchor, and the independent woman had found her partner. Together they had discovered that even in the wild frontier, love was the most powerful force of all.